History is filled with stories about families that encounter what are known as noisy spirits. These are supposed entities which, while invisible to the human eye, lift objects and toss them around the house. For fun, it seems. They're fun. These pesky ghosts go by another name as well. Poltergeists. It's a German word. Polter means to make a sound and Geist meaning ghost. Poltergeists have also been known to bang on walls, scratch at windows, and to make objects, say a tiny stone, appear out of thin air. There's one famous case in Yorkshire, England, where a domino appeared out of thin air, barely missed the head of an investigator, and bounced off a window. The spirit behind that little trick is said to be the ghost of a deceased monk. When the Irving family moved into a little farm located at Cashen's Gap on the Isle of Man, they thought they would settle down for a quiet life after Jim, the dad, had retired from his job selling pianos. There were 3 of them. There was Jim, his wife, and their 12-year-old daughter, Vori. Well, actually, there were 4 occupants of the house. The 4th, which would become known by some as the Dalby spook, wasn't a deceased monk, a devil, nor a bipedal shadow that passed through walls. The spook was none of these things. The Irvings, they would claim, had a strange encounter with a mongoose. It all started with the scratching. Old farmhouses can be drafty places, and the one the Irvings moved into was no exception. This was in the 1930s. While electricity was a thing, the Irvings' farm didn't enjoy such amenities. They didn't have a phone, nor any form of entertainment. Vori liked music, but without electricity, that meant no radio. She did have a gramophone, however, one of those models you could play with a hand crank. Their nearest neighbor was quite a ways away as well. The Irvings were essentially in a little bubble with only themselves to keep each other company. They lived by candlelight, and when the scratching behind the walls began, it made for more than a few restless nights. So, drafty or not, something was making the noises. The most likely culprit was rats or some other tiny rodent. But, Vori would say, their rodent wasn't just scratching at the walls or offering the occasional knock or two. It was also making other noises. Noises that could be described as vocalizations. Their unseen occupant was trying to speak. And then, one night, Vori saw it. There was a small box-like partition in the rafters near her bed, and that's where the thing lived, she came to realize. And it wasn't a rat, although it looked somewhat like a rat, if rats had bushy tails, a flat snout, and a yellow face. Whatever it is that hung out in the rafters and the walls, it wasn't any rat or rodent they had ever seen. It was something else. And this something else wasn't content with leaving it all at the occasional knock and scratch. This thing decided to do something else. It wanted to communicate. The communication started simple enough. Vori was the first to hear it. When she would have trouble sleeping, which was often given the circumstances, she would recite old nursery rhymes or prayers, only to hear them crudely repeated back. The voice was clear and definitely not her parents'. It wasn't exactly human-sounding either. Its pitch was a bit too high to be human. And then, one night, their little visitor grew tired of knocking on walls, moving things around here and there, and mimicking Vori's attempts to lull herself to sleep. So, it introduced itself. To the family's horror, the creature said its name was Jeff. Not only that, but he wasn't even human. Jeff told the Irvings that he was a mongoose born in New Delhi, India in 1852. He first lived with a tall man with a green turban. After that, he lived with a hunchback. How did he end up in England to live in a farmhouse on the Isle of Man? He was brought there from Egypt by a man named Holland. Of course, it makes perfect sense, right? But that wasn't all. Jeff wasn't an ordinary mongoose. In fact, he wasn't actually a mongoose. He was a spirit in the form of a mongoose. Why this was the case, he didn't explain, but he added that,
I am a freak. I have hands and I have feet. And if you saw me, you'd faint. You'd be petrified, mummified, turned into stone or a pillar of salt. You don't know what damage or harm I could do if I were roused. I could kill you all. But I won't. I'll split the atom. I am the fifth dimension. I am the eighth wonder of the world.
He wasn't a very pleasant mongoose or earthbound spirit, it appeared. One night, terrified of Jeff, the Irvings tried to barricade a door to keep him out, only to have the door bulge as if from some great force trying to burst its way in. To show them that he didn't need to enter the room through a door, he stopped pushing and instead smashed a jar of ointment in the room behind them. When he wasn't spouting off on how much he knew or how clever he was, he would go back to scratching at the walls, snarling, or spitting at the Irvings from different corners of the room. And when he wasn't engaged in any of those fun activities, he would retreat to his little box in the rafters of Vori's room, which she called Jeff's sanctum. The Irvings, while horrified at the strange little creature that had taken up residence with them, had decided to live with it. And Jeff, it seemed, decided to live with them too, or at least to tolerate them. You might even say they developed a silent understanding between them. Not knowing if Jeff had to eat, they would leave little bits of food for him, such as bananas, bacon, or biscuits. And when they weren't looking, Jeff would dart out, grab the food, and disappear. Except eggs. Jeff hated eggs. He also, in turn, brought them food in the form of strangled rabbits, which he liked to leave for them on the kitchen floor. And then there was Carolina Moon, which Jeff would sing to whenever Vori played it on her gramophone. It was a strange coexistence, made even stranger when Jeff would do something kind, such as to put out the fire for them at night if they'd forgotten, only to call James a fat-headed gnome or Vori's mother a witch woman later that same day. Other days he would follow them to the market to keep them company, and on good days he would stay out of sight and chat. On bad days, he would toss stones, pebbles, or the occasional insult. He was very generous with the insults and offhanded threats of violence. And if Jeff decided he'd had enough and didn't want to chat anymore, he would proclaim, "Vanished," out loud, and do just that. He'd vanish and they wouldn't hear from him for hours or even days. Eventually, word of Jeff's presence began to make the rounds, and people would show up on the Irving's door hoping to catch sight of the clever little creature. And some claimed to have seen him too, while others said that they'd heard him. But what was lacking was actual, hard, physical evidence. So they got some, in the form of hair that they said was Jeff's, as well as some paw and teeth prints they had coerced Jeff into making using plasticine blocks. And then they waited for the results. The hair, it turned out, came from a dog. The plasticine prints were another story. Having been sent off to zoologist Reginald Pocock of the Natural History Museum, they were unidentified and said not to be of any known animal. In other words, they definitely were not made by a mongoose, at least not any mongoose on record, of which Jeff, it can be said, definitely wasn't. Not one that could talk, sing, spit, and throw objects around a house. There were investigations as well. Outside of hair samples and plasticine blocks, famed paranormal investigator Harry Price performed an intensive investigation of the Irving's claims. He and editor Richard Lambert from The Listener wrote a book about it in 1936 called The Haunting of Cashen's Gap. Their conclusion? They didn't reach one. While not coming right out and discounting the presence of a supernatural talking mongoose, Price did point out that the structure of the farmhouse lent itself to sounds from one part of the house sounding as if they were coming from another. And based on this, there have been suggestions that Vori may have been a natural ventriloquist and had perpetrated a hoax on her parents that had gone a bit too far. And while it doesn't explain everything, it might explain why Jeff was more often heard than seen. But he was seen by the Irvings and by others, if those accounts are to be believed. There are even a couple of pictures purported to be of Jeff, but could very well be a cat or some other furry little creature. A paranormal researcher, Dr. Nandor Fodor, suggested that Jeff may have been a form of tulpa, or thought form, unintentionally created by Jim Irving, perhaps even a part of his personality, which split off and became real. Far-fetched? I suppose when you're trying to explain a mongoose-like creature who calls itself Jeff, anything goes. And of the Irvings? Vori and her mom eventually moved out of the farmhouse after Jim died, which was in 1945. And many years later, in the 1970s, a writer for Fate magazine managed to get Vori to talk about the hauntings at Cashen's Gap all those years ago. Vori said that, yes, all of those things had really happened, and that they had been done by a little creature who called himself Jeff. But if she'd had her way, Jeff would have left them alone and not bothered them. And what of Jeff? Has he ever been heard from since? Well, the short answer is no. There have been no more spectacular or strange stories about a talking mongoose. The farm the Irvings once lived in has long since been demolished. But the story didn't exactly end when Vori and her mother left in 1945. The man who bought the farmhouse, Leslie Graham, had a very strange encounter of his own in 1947 with a small creature at the farm. A small creature which he subsequently trapped and shot and killed. It wasn't a ferret or a weasel. It was something strange that he hadn't seen before. But since it was dead, he couldn't say whether or not it was Jeff. And if it was, Jeff has long since vanished. Thank you for listening. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and leave a review. It really does help others find the show. And if you know someone who might enjoy the show, please tell them about it. You can find more information and the references that went into this episode by going to strangeencounters.org. I would really like to hear your suggestions for future episodes too. And if you've had a strange encounter with something unusual or paranormal, I would love to hear about it. Visit the contact page for information on submitting your story. And until next time, please take care of yourself. It's a strange world out there. Good night.
After knocking your city, save, making show, I'm the solution of it.